What's up, guys? I'm Brittany. This is CrashCourse Rhetoric, and this week we're going to examine artifacts pertaining to Christopher Columbus. Now, obviously, he was the guy who sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But were we taught the whole story? How did he become the man who has his own federal holiday? In this video, we will examine the edited story that is taught in the American school system, the ideologies that are perpetuated along with that, and the narratives excluded from this biased, white, European narrative. Christopher Columbus and Rhetoric. Each one is not like the other, but the combination reveals how this introductory history lesson that is taught in 3rd grade embodies some very prevalent issues in our society. In last week's video, we talked about rhetoric and defined the different kinds of rhetorical analysis. To recap, rhetoric is writing done by any person at any time for any reason. It is how content is arranged by an author with a specific audience in mind to persuade the most amount of people in that audience or to make those people aware of something they were ignorant to. This includes the neo-Aristotelian rhetoric taught in schools with ethos, logos, and pathos. But moving beyond that, a rhetorician needs to look at things from different lenses, whether that be a racial lens, a feminist lens, or a generic lens, that allows the person to realize all of what the author intended to communicate, not just what is available at first glance. In this discussion of Christopher Columbus, we will be looking at a number of artifacts using narrative criticism, cluster criticism, and ideological criticism. The first artifact we're going to look at today is the traditional Anglo story of Christopher Columbus, which was written, created, and published by the History Channel. The description for the video written by the History Channel is, though he didn't produce much profit from the monarchs of Spain, Columbus opened a path to the New World for Europe. But here's the full story.
Columbus went to Spain seeking funds from the Spanish monarchy to sail west and find a quicker route to India. He signed a contract with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella and secured 10% of the profit. After crossing the Atlantic, Columbus was separated from his fleet during a storm, so just 3 ships landed on an island in the Bahamas where the men encountered the indigenous peoples for the first time. In doing so, he opened the Western world for Europe. Columbus thought he was in India and so called these people Indians, a term that would continue to present day. But the Bahamas did not yield the riches, specifically gold, that Spain was expecting, and thus his trip was considered a failure. At that time, there was no benefit in finding the New World. Columbus took 3 trips to the New World before he died trying to obtain glory.
Hey, high school me, pay attention! Now this story is one we are all familiar with and have heard for most of our lives and would not, like high school me, pay attention during if a teacher played this during class. It is a story that embodies the idea of Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. But let's look at this ideologically. This story conveys a lot of the same ideals as the rest of American history in regards to patriotism and masculinity. Columbus is reduced to that of a businessman who fought for his shot, overcame adversity, and found entire new continents for the country that believed in him. And this perseverance is the idea of the Republican man that has persisted throughout American history with Western expansion and is what the American dream is built on. And so, by teaching this story to children who are still very impressionable, the biased Anglo version of Christopher Columbus perpetuates the ideals and shows these kids that this is the motivation they should embody and this is the glory they should be wanting to achieve. Now, why do I keep saying that this version of the story, as told by the History Channel, is white and biased? Let's examine the group of people left out from this traditional story, namely the Native Americans, who were greatly impacted from the moment of his arrival, and the Italians, who were essential in creating Columbus Day. WatchCut, a YouTube channel that conducts various social experiments, created a series called One Word. As a part of the series, they had men and women who identify as Native Americans sit in a room and give their honest first reaction to hearing the name Christopher Columbus. The participants were almost immediately overcome with emotion as they remembered what Columbus did to their ancestors. The most common phrases used to describe him were evil and fuck you, with one person calling him a terrorist. Now, based on the narrative everyone knows, it could be assumed that this is because Columbus has come to represent the white man who oppressed their people, killed their people, and removed them entirely from their way of life because they were viewed as inferior. And while this is part of his legacy, it does not include all the atrocities Columbus committed himself. Upon first interacting with the native populations, Columbus noted in his journals that the people were generally gentle and giving peoples. He and his crew, however, immediately examined these people from the Europeans' perspective. These notes seemed like honest observations, but they were the very things they used to deem this civilization as primal and inferior. In copying his admiral's initial observations, it is written on October 11th that,
"As I saw that they were very friendly to us, but they seemed on the whole to me to be a very poor people. Weapons they have none, nor are acquainted with them, for I showed them swords which they grasped by the blades, and cut themselves through ignorance. They would be good servants, and I am of the opinion that they would very readily become Christians, and they appear to have no religion. If it please our Lord, I intend at my return to carry home 6 of them to your Highness."
Columbus took more than 6 Native Americans back to Spain, and the ones that survived the journey were paraded through Barcelona and Seville. Between 1493 and 1501, Columbus brought 3,000 Native Americans to Europe. One of the first peoples Columbus dominated were the Arawaks. The Arawaks helped Columbus when one of his ships was shipwrecked, and their hard work impressed him so much that he decided to use their work ethic to benefit Spain. He forced them to work in gold mines where many died from exhaustion. If the slave did not deliver what was expected of him, his hands were often cut off and displayed around his neck, as a warning to the other men. After 2 years of slavery and a mass suicide of 100, half the population, or 125,000 Native Americans, were dead. When Columbus returned to Arawak Island on his second trip to the New World, he brought cannons and attack dogs to further intimidate the indigenous people. If the Spaniards ran out of meat for these dogs, Arawak babies were killed to feed them. Columbus also supervised sex traffickers who would raid villages for 9 and 10-year-old indigenous females, as they were the most desired by the Spaniards. Now, all of a sudden, the reactions of the Native Americans in the Watch Cut video are more than warranted. This man is not just a symbol of the Native American oppression, but he set the precedent of how the Native Americans were to be treated. It's also understandable why elementary schools don't want to teach their 8 and 9-year-old kids that kids their age were being treated thanks to Columbus. However, that does not justify why the Native Americans are completely deleted from the story.
But Brittany, this dude sucks. Why do we have Columbus Day?
Great question, nerdy high school me. Let's look at why we have a day off to celebrate a man who we now know is not the hero our elementary school teachers told us he was, and a man who never set foot on the North American continent. It's no surprise that there were large anti-immigration sentiments across American history, and each minority was looking for a way to fit in. The Italians were one of these peoples. One of the largest lynchings in United States history was in New Orleans in 1891, when 11 Sicilians were hanged for killing the police commissioner even though they were found not guilty. A year after this, to lessen the sentiment, President Benjamin Harrison declared a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus landing in the Bahamas as an attempt to rally patriotism and show that Columbus himself and every other man in America was an immigrant. This marked the first time the day was celebrated. In his declaration, Harrison never once mentioned Columbus's journey, but instead stated,
"On that day let the people, so far as possible, cease from toil and devote themselves to such exercises as may best honor to the discoverer and their appreciation of the great achievements of the 4 completed centuries of American life."
Columbus Day was first celebrated in Colorado in 1906 after the Italian head of their first newspaper advertised the day and made it known to the people. Columbus Day was not made an official federal holiday until Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, after a Catholic fraternal organization called Knights of Columbus pushed for it because they wanted to prove Italian Roman Catholics were always part of American life. Congress ratified this holiday in 1970 and declared it to be the second Monday of October. By acknowledging this man who was Catholic and from Italy, the Italians now belonged because a common ancestor embodied the same ideals that this country did. They now had a place and were now white. They were no longer a minority. Now that we know all the history, let's look at what this all means. These words associated with Columbus are vastly different across the artifacts discussed in this video. In the white story, he is a hero, a discoverer, and even a failure. That is vastly different than the words used by Native Americans themselves, like terrorists. And this creates an element of surprise because these sentiments are so different from the ones that the American school system gives most of its students. The traditional story taught in schools and the stories that are omitted from that education have the same characters. There's Christopher Columbus, the king and queen of Spain, his 3 famous ships, the island in the Bahamas, and the native peoples that inhabited it. But each story has a different take on these characters. Columbus is both the antagonist and the protagonist. In one artifact, he is an explorer, a hero, and a visionary, while in the other, he's an invader, murderer, and rapist. Certainly he doesn't see himself that way. He saw himself as one of the bravest men in Spain. And the white story keeps with that idea. In this story, Native Americans provide no resistance to Columbus's exploration and are of very little importance. This was able to be created because white people didn't experience any consequences of Columbus's actions because the consequence is colonialization and, as a result, today's society. Not focusing on that destruction allows for Columbus as a character to be portrayed as a hero and allows for a celebration of how modern society in the Americas came to be. And that is the first thing students learn about history. The first real introduction the American education system provides to the crimes against indigenous people is the Trail of Tears, which happened 343 years after Columbus kidnapped the first Native Americans and brought them back to Spain. Ideologically, the omission of the Native American narrative from the American education system perpetuates the idea that it is okay to edit a story for the sake of nationalism and patriotism. It plays into the stereotype of the Americans thinking that the United States is the best country in all of existence and we should focus on glory, on the American dream that was created instead of all that was sacrificed to build the country. All of this culminates in the fact that no story is ever truly complete. Education itself is biased and has an agenda, and it often mimics the best version of the story. The story we were taught is a myth, and like any myth, it has a hero who perhaps could have done more, but ultimately created and achieved something beyond his wildest dreams. But it also seems to make it okay to forget about all the other parts of the story that were omitted to make that myth a reality. Therefore, the main purpose of rhetoric is to examine all parts of as many things as possible so people can have a complete understanding of what happened and draw conclusions about what needs to be changed from that. The Christopher Columbus myth is arguably less important than the Native American lens of this story, and we can learn more about who the U.S. is as a country and where we came from and the ideologies that are woven into our thought processes from the tragic things done to them. Rhetoric aids a person in decoding things that were decided by some white guy hundreds of years ago and allows the younger generation to decide if they want to keep the story or tell the truth, and that's a personal choice. That's all I have this week. You guys can find all the research used in this video linked below. Tune in next week as we'll look at the rhetoric of fantasy fiction books. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.